land of the free. Farewell to the land of the brave. Alas, that my country should be America, land of the slave. What if the Negroes despised and degraded, and scorned and reproach are heaped on his head, and perished the thought that would leave him unaided? American soil shall be that which I tread. Farewell to the land of the free. Farewell to the land of the brave. Alas, that my country should be America, land of the slave. Farewell to the land of the free. Farewell to the land of the brave. Alas, that my country should be America, land of the slave. What if I've drunk of the cup that awaits me, one bitter foretaste already? Do I glean from the prospect no thought that elates me, if in freedom's great cause counted worthy to die? Farewell to the land of the free. Farewell to the land of the brave. Alas, that my country should be America, land of the slave. Farewell to the land of the free. Farewell to the land of the brave. Alas, that my country should be America, land of the slave. Am I not wanted where warfare is raging? Shall I, like a coward, not join in the fight? Shrink from the onslaught when battle is raging, seared by the enemy's tyrannous fight? Farewell to the land of the free. Farewell to the land of the brave. Alas, that my country should be America, land of the slave. Farewell to the land of the free. Farewell to the land of the brave. Alas, that my country should be America, land of the slave. Give me then, friends, the weapon that's wielded best in the cause I am sworn to uphold. I will fight until the foe shall have yielded, for the years of my sojourn on earth have been told. Farewell to the land of the free. Farewell to the land of the brave. Alas, us that my country should be America, land of the slave.
Good evening. Thank you and welcome. My name is Tiana Stevens, and I'm honored to be your MC tonight. Thank you to Jonathan Rhodes and Lee Wright of the Eastman School of Music for that wonderful performance. The farewell song of Frederick Douglass was originally written by British abolitionists to celebrate Frederick Douglass's emancipation from slavery and return to the United States in 1847. A copy of this rare music was recently acquired by the University of Rochester, home to one of the world's great collections of material on Douglass. The song, which has not been performed in more than 150 years, is a perfect piece of music to open tonight's program honoring Frederick Douglass, America's prophet of freedom. In 1847, Frederick Douglass and Anna Murray Douglass moved their family to Rochester to start a new chapter in their lives. On this very day, 171 years ago, he printed the first edition of the North Star, just a few blocks from where we are gathered tonight. Over the next 25 years, Douglass and his family made Rochester an indispensable part of the abolitionist movement and struggle for racial justice. He fought against segregated schools in the city and gave his most memorable speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," in Rochester's majestic Corinthian Hall in 1852. He and Mrs. Douglass ran an important stop on the Underground Railroad, and from his Rochester base, he publicly challenged President Abraham Lincoln to free enslaved people at the start of the Civil War. He worked with a range of Rochester reformers to make the American dream accessible for all. To say that he was extraordinary would be a gross understatement. All of his life, Rochester remained close to his heart. When he died at Cedar Hill, his home in the Anacostia section of Washington, D.C., in 1895, the Douglass family knew what to do: return him to his beloved home. And before he was laid to rest in Mount Hope Cemetery, Douglass's funeral was held in the very building you are now sitting in, formerly the Central Presbyterian Church. Even after he died, the famed Douglass statue in downtown Rochester would be lifted as a constant memorial to the man whose eternal struggle for justice inspired and still inspires generations of freedom fighters. Tonight, we gather to honor that life and legacy. In word and song, we mark Douglass's impact on the city, the nation, and the world. He was truly a prophet of freedom. Before we begin our program, on behalf of tonight's sponsors, the University of Rochester and the Rochester Institute of Technology, we must acknowledge some of the key people and institutions who have made this night possible. There are many to thank, so please hold your applause until all have been named. University of Rochester President Richard Feldman and Rochester Institute of Technology President David Munson, thank you for your vision and leadership in helping to solidify the legacy of Frederick Douglass. Tonight we pay tribute to the memory of the late U of R Dean and Vice President Dr. Paul Burgett, whose leadership and dedication to the promotion, understanding, and appreciation of cultural differences and multiple perspectives has inspired countless students, faculty, and staff at the U of R and beyond. He inspires us at this very moment, and we are grateful to have known him. Thank you to the City of Rochester, Mayor Lovely Warren, and former Mayor Bill Johnson for helping us make tonight's event even more memorable. We have many dignitaries here tonight, and we are truly grateful for your presence and support. Thank you to the Hochstein School of Music and Dance for allowing us to gather in this significant space. Thank you, of course, to our keynote speaker, Mr. David Blight, and to all of tonight's performers and presenters for generously being part of this dynamic program. Thank you to the many members of the Frederick Douglass Bicentennial Commemoration Committee, convened by Carvin Eisen of RCTV and Blue Cease of Rochester Contemporary Art Center. And a very special thanks to our Chair Emeritus, Dr. David Sankofa Anderson, and Ms. Ruth Anderson, our beloved Douglass expert. We're privileged to be joined by the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives and its founding members, Nettie Washington Douglass, Kenneth B. Morris Jr., and Robert J. Benz. If that was not enough, we'd like to extend special greetings to writer and civil rights activist Mr. Sean King, who will soon launch a digital version of the North Star newspaper to address the injustices of today's world. Sean, we welcome you and your family to Rochester. We'd also like to acknowledge our ushers, esteemed members of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, Eta Rho Lambda chapter, and members of the Eureka Lodge of Rochester. Our city is ever grateful for the efforts of the Eureka Lodge, who made possible our historic Douglass statue, the first monument in the United States to be dedicated to an African-American citizen. To our interpreting staff from RIT, thank you for being here tonight. We appreciate your service. And finally, to our event co-chairs, Jessica Locker-Feldman, Autumn Haig, and Rich Newman, with special thanks to Chris Christopher, our stage manager. Thank you all. And at this time, I'd like to invite to the stage Reverend Julius D. Jackson of Trinity Emmanuel Presbyterian Church to give the invocation.
Good evening. Let us pray. Almighty God, we take pause at this moment not because of who we are, but because of who you are. We of many faiths and no faith traditions call on you by your many names, asking for your presence this evening as we give recognition to one of your own in the person born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, known to us as Frederick Douglass. This American social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman, Douglass, who escaped both physical and mental slavery despite the odds. Lord, we ask that in the midst of this celebratory occasion, during these challenging times in our nation, that you allow that spirit which you provided Douglass to encompass us about and pierce the heart filled with hate with the spirit of love. God, knowing that when the question was posed in Scripture in Micah, what does the Lord require of thee? And the answer returned, to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with thy God. Our prayer tonight is that the Spirit not just dwell here in this place, yet like a pebble on the ocean, the ripples continue on and on. Give us a spirit to do justly. Give us the spirit to love mercy. Give us the spirit to walk humbly with you in hope, in peace, in joy, and in love. These blessings we ask in the spirit of Douglass, the prophets before, after, and those yet to come, and most importantly, in the faith, in the mighty name of Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. I'm now pleased to bring to the stage Professor Carvin Eisen, the moving spirit behind the Douglass Bicentennial Commemoration in Rochester and project director of Re-Energizing the Legacy of Frederick Douglass. Please help me welcome Professor Eisen.
Welcome. I am so absolutely thrilled to be here. I just can't get over the fact that 120 years ago, more than 120 years ago, in this very site was the homegoing ceremony for Frederick Douglass. And 120 years later, Frederick Douglass is still pulling people into the room. Who can do that? Who can do that? Who can do that? Who can do that, right? As Associate Professor in Journalism, Broadcasting, and Public Relations at the College at Rockport, I needed to say that because my boss is here, but I would have said it anyway. But, and also as General Manager of Rochester Community Television, one of the things that I think is essential as an educator to do is to try to get people to do, my students to do better than they think they can do. You understand what I'm saying? To try to perform better than they would do otherwise. So tonight, for a moment, I want you to imagine that you're my student, okay? You all are my students tonight for just this moment. So, are you with me? Can you do it? Okay, can you do it? All right. When I say Frederick, you say, all right, and I mean say Douglas, okay? Frederick. Come on, you can do better than that. Frederick. 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 Freedom. Rochester. Frederick Douglass. All right. This is more than I could have ever imagined, really. When we set out over a year ago, Blue, Cease, and I, Blue, are you here? Is Blue Cease in this room? All right, I'll just have to go on without him if he's not here. He's here? Blue, please stand up and take a bow so people can see you. Blue Cease and I, thank you. Thank you so much. Blue Cease and I had many conversations. We looked around to see what was going on, if there was going to be an exceptional presentation this year to celebrate the bicentennial. And seeing nothing, we decided that we would try to start something. And at first, of course, it's difficult, but look at what has happened in Rochester, New York this year. We have, chief among the things that we were able to do is to put a series of monuments identical to the monument that is standing behind me on the streets of Rochester, New York. And I want to tell you, this is no mean feat, all right? This is no simple feat to do, because putting a monument on the street of an American city of a Black man in 2018 is still a challenging endeavor, even if that man happens to be Frederick Douglass. So we did that. We're excited. Go to douglastour.com to find out where the rest of them are, to find out why they are in the location that they're in, and enjoy them. They're going to be on the streets, we hope, for 3 years, and this is an incredible exploration, exercise, research project to see what will happen, how people will respond to them. Now, going forward, I just want to say there's another person who has to be recognized, and it is artist Olivia Kim. Olivia, if you are here, would you please stand up and take a bow? Please stand up. All right? All right? And the thousands and literally thousands of volunteers that have participated in making this happen. And we set out to do this, but I'm telling you, it could not be done unless Olivia, with her artistry, her sophistication, her passion, and her attention to detail, each one of these monuments is almost like her child. She goes with them, she pulls them out of the ground when necessary and takes them back to her studio if they get a little damaged. So it's really wonderful, and I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, because you help to make our vision clear and good for our community, and I thank you for that. As I wrap up now, I just want to remind you that this culmination, this is beginning to be the conclusion of this now, but this has been an exceptional journey that has involved over 100 arts organizations, non-for-profits, individuals, educational institutions, the city government, the county government, and a team of people who said, together we are better than we are as individuals. And we all work together to make this happen. As we go forward, I will remind you that artist choreographer Garth Fagan, who is no stranger to many of you, has produced a dance called the North Star, and it has its Rochester premiere Wednesday, December 5th through Sunday, December 9th. And I encourage each one of you to go there, to go out to Nazareth College Arts Center and see it. It's an exceptional work where he essentially brings Frederick Douglass to present, brings him to now. And finally now, as I leave, I just want to say this. This is what's important to me. This is the essence of what it is all about. Rochester, New York has a social justice history that is second to no city in this country. And today, we need to get back to that. We need to go back there for our children. We need to go back there. Thank you. We need to get back there for our country. We need to go back there for our children. And if in 100 years, when it's time to do this again, and none of us are here, we want to be able to say that we took up the scepter, we carried the word forward, and now it's time to push that message out there. Thank you so ever so much.
It is now my distinct honor to welcome to the stage the mayor of our great city, the Honorable Lovely A. Warren.
Thank you, Tiana. Back in January of this year, I stood here at Hochstein, a place that is still filled with great energy and great life and love and respect for Frederick Douglass. And I came to call on his memory. At that time, we were launching the bicentennial celebration of Douglass's life and proclaiming 2018 as the year of Douglass. As the months followed, we had exhibits and performances, a unique time-lapse photograph taken of his statue in Highland Park, an old-fashioned birthday party. We did a community-wide marathon reading of his book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. I awarded him posthumously the key to the city during the Friends of Frederick Douglass wreath-laying ceremony. Over the past year, I've seen how Douglass inspires people like writer and activist Shaun King, who is launching the North Star, a new multimedia service. I also want to extend a warm Rochester welcome to Yale historian David Blight, who joins us to talk about his book, Prophet of Freedom, which covers new ground and draws on new sources to enrich our outstanding understanding of Douglass. I am excited to welcome here tonight because he shows us that as much as we learned this year, there is so much more to know about our beloved Frederick Douglass. In the process of all these celebrations, I've been blessed with the chance to meet several of Douglass's descendants. I am grateful especially for Ken Morris, Nettie Washington Douglass, and Robert Benz from the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, who are here with us tonight. They've done a lot to support our efforts and to shine light on Douglass's legacy. We have honored our famous son in murals and in life-size statues designed by Olivia Kim with the help of hundreds of volunteers and placed them all around our city. These statues tell visitors why each location is important to our community's history and to Douglass's past. We installed a marker to draw attention to the location on Alexander Street that was the Douglass family's first home, where he lived with his wife and 5 children. I remain amazed and inspired at everything that Frederick Douglass Bicentennial Committee has accomplished this year in highlighting and educating us all about this great man and his great work. In particular, Let's offer a big round of applause to some of the lead partners: Carvin Eisen, Chris Christopher, RCTV, Rochester Contemporary Art Center, Blue Seas, as well as RIT and the University of Rochester. Also, I want to thank Hochstein for hosting us once again, to the artist Olivia Kim for her wonderful statues, and Michelle Daniels for all she's done throughout the years to keep Douglas's legacy alive. The year of Frederick Douglass has been a wonderful year because it drew so many talented people together to organize events, and I'm afraid that we'll be here all night if I name them all. But know that our city's understanding and pride in our history has only grown larger because of all of your collective efforts. Now, when I include one of my favorite Douglass quotes in a speech, it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. I can see everyone in the audience saying it with me. But reflecting back on a wonderful year of events, one image sticks in my mind. I hope you've had a chance to see the murals at the Douglas Branch Library and the new Anna Marie Douglas School Number 12. They are the work of our wonderful Rochester artist, Sean Dunwoody, and worth enjoying in their own right. What I really appreciate about what Sean did is that many children on their way to school each day pause and give the mural a gentle fist bump. To them, Frederick Douglass is a friend, he's a peer, and someone that they can acknowledge with this simple, familiar greeting. When I think of that, and when I saw that, I realized that those of us eager to bring Douglass's legacy into the present have succeeded. I realized that what we did this year by working together has had an impact, that Rochester's children can grow up with the pride of knowing about this great ancestor of ours. They will know about his efforts to end slavery, oppression, and inequality. And hopefully, they will find in that history the wisdom and courage to finish what he started. By highlighting the life of one of Rochester's best-known freedom fighters, we inspire today's freedom fighters and today's freedom fighters of tomorrow. Rochester will forever be known as Douglass's chosen home, not just the keeper of his grave, but we are the keeper of his legacy. To show our appreciation to some of the essential players in tonight's event, I have here a special gift, an image of Frederick Douglass based on a sketch that I fell in love with when I first saw it. Frank Argento is a retired professor at RIT who taught fine arts and applied design for 50 years. He's not just a gifted teacher, he's a gifted artist. 10 years ago, he was asked to create portraits of 10 Rochester inventors, and Frederick Douglass was one of them. Those paintings are now at RIT's Center for Urban Entrepreneurship downtown. But it was this sketch that Frank made in preparation for that project that I enjoyed the most. This year, he took that sketch and he turned it into a charcoal drawing and made several special prints. What we have here tonight, a hand-colored print, each is very unique. And on behalf of the artist, I would like to present the hand-colored pastel print to the descendants of Frederick Douglass who join us here today from the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative. Thank you all for coming, and please enjoy the show.
Thank you, Mayor Warren. I'd also like to acknowledge the beautiful city logo, the commemorative logo that you see here tonight. That is from the office of Mayor Lovely Warren, so we're certainly appreciative of that. Please welcome to the stage Thomas Warfield and Lee Wright, who will perform 2 songs that were well known to Douglass. We hope these songs will resonate with you as well.
is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to soothe the sin-sick soul. Sometimes I feel discouraged and think my life's in vain. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. If you cannot sing like angels, if you cannot preach like Paul, you can tell the love of Jesus and say he died for all. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. A long way from home, a long way from home. Steal away, steal away, steal away home. Sometimes I feel like we're almost there. Sometimes almost there. Sometimes I feel like we're almost there. A long way from
Thank you, Thomas and Lee. That was absolutely beautiful. So beautiful, I came out early to get the best seat. It was worth it. At this time, we'll have some remarks from Dr. Muhammad Shafiq of Nazareth College, who will tell you that Frederick Douglass revered in the prophets of old, finding in them lessons for his time and for all time. Please help me welcome to the stage Dr. Muhammad Shafiq.
Good evening. I teach a course on the civil rights. I have been involved in the civil rights work since when I was in Philadelphia since 1976. But when I teach this course, I begin with Frederick Douglass, amazing personality. And I take, especially in Nazareth College, when I teach this course, I take my student right to the cemetery and mouth open. We all stand there. You know who is there? Our historian who talks about him. And that is Dr. David Anderson. He is sitting somewhere here. I would like him to stand. Amazing personality. We talked, we stayed all there, my students and everybody, and we talked about him. Something which I learned since I came from 76, since I was involved, and then about the civil rights movement, and especially focusing on Frederick Douglass. He teaches one thing. That is the foundation that we can move on and write theses and theses on that. He said, there is no progress without struggle. No progress without struggle. And for struggle, you do not need to look for outside help. It is right there in you, and you have the power to bring that change. The change is within yourself, but you have to stand up and take a step. Very amazing. When we think about this thing, and then for that change to bring, his emphasis is on education. His beautiful words, education is light. Education is emancipation. Education is freedom. Education is power. And that you will never be able to change the condition of the people unless you start from yourself to change the condition. And God does not help you unless you stand up and help yourself, and then you receive the support of God there. I was looking for a Quranic verse for that. And similar words, Inna Allah la yughayyiru ma biqawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim. God will not change the condition of individual, people, community, unless they take step to change, to make that change possible, and then they will see the support of God coming to that. You know, it is a very simple lesson. Many of you have been able to bring that change, whether yourself, within your community, through education process, through other means. But I want to give you myself also when I was a student. And I said to my wife, there is something deeper in his teaching for us, how to raise our kids. Because he emphasized and re-emphasized on family. I said we need to live simple and save and spend that money on our children's education. We didn't have much, very much like daily wages that you see what we had. But we did not eat outside in hotels. We always cooked at home to save that money. We buy very simple clothing and other things, not spending money on that. We save that money for our children. And what we did, we struggled, but we gave good education to our children. Very good education to our children. And now we see how they will be able to raise their families and how they will bring the next change. So if we do that, this is my learning from him, and this is my advice to many of us who are still struggling to bring that change which Frederick.
We come now to our distinguished keynote speaker, David Blight. It is our honor to welcome Professor Blight back to Rochester during the Frederick Douglass Bicentennial. It is especially significant to welcome him on the 171st anniversary of the North Star's very first printing. David Blight is class of 1954 professor at Yale University and the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. He is one of America's leading historians and the author of several groundbreaking books, including Race and Reunion, which has been called one of the 10 most important books ever published on the Civil War era. Of course, he is here tonight to talk about his new book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. Called the definitive biography of Douglass, it is a product of more than a decade of research, some of it conducted right here in Rochester, appropriately. This book has been well worth the wait. Critics have praised Blight's biography as moving, monumental, and worthy of the great Douglass himself. We're so excited that he could be with us tonight on this special anniversary in Frederick Douglass's adopted hometown of Rochester. Please help me welcome Professor David Blight.
Tiana, special thanks. Mayor Warren, the musicians, my God, Thomas Warfield, Lee Wright, wherever you are. Carvin, thank you for all the work you've done. Reverend Jackson. I want to mention quickly, if I can, and I'm going to forget a few people. I have some fellow Douglass scholars in this audience tonight, some of whom have come a lot of miles to be here for this celebration, to be in Rochester for this night. Jim Trotman, who is out here somewhere. I think I see you. I can't see past the fifth row, but I think that's you, Jim. Lee Faught is here tonight. Lee just published a year or so ago a book called Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, and I strongly recommend you buy that right after you buy mine, but get it. I'm serious. Rich Newman, my old friend who helped organize this whole thing at RIT, a great scholar of abolitionism and knows everything about Douglass in Rochester and everything about a lot of other things. Thank you, Rich. Larry Hudson, who teaches here at the University of Rochester, and Jessica from the archives. at the University of Rochester, who showed us today that original sheet music, which I found breathtaking. To know that the actual sheet music survived, written by Julia Griffiths and her brother. And I may say a little more about Julia Griffiths and that a bit later. I used to think that, I've had the privilege to speak in a lot of places, and I used to think that the most intimidating place I ever spoke was on the stage of Ford's Theater in Washington, because right above you to your left, as you stand there at some podium, is that booth. The box, box, booth. That's not a joke line, I'm sorry. But there it is, and it's God, you just got to lose yourself in your subject. But this may top it. I have never spoken anywhere with him looking over me. In fact, he does stay stationary, doesn't he? Because at any moment, I was sitting, I got, from the side angle back there, I looked at that right hand and I thought if I misquote him or if I misinterpret it, I get something really wrong, I'm just afraid that right hand's going to reach out, get me by the collar and just say, "You're out of here." Easy. I want to say too, thank you to Rochester, you, all of Rochester, because what you did here is far harder than what I did, which is to write a book. Not that that's not easy, not hard, but what you've all done is, congratulate yourselves. You brought a whole city or community or region and universities and schools, people of all ages together across religious lines, racial lines, I hope class lines, to not just celebrate, but to imagine and understand how past and present are always running together, always linked, always informing one another. So, congratulations, Rochester. And I actually want to refer back to one of the songs to start. Balm and Gilead. I told the musicians, by the way, I had the privilege to sit back in the recital practice room while they were rehearsing. I've never been in a green room preparing for a lecture with musicians doing Balm and Gilead right in front of me. It doesn't get any better than that. But the original passage in the Bible comes from the Old Testament. It's in Jeremiah 8:22. We sing the great hymn, which is, I'm not kidding, my favorite spiritual. We sing it as an affirmative New Testament statement. There is a balm in Gilead. There is a balm. But read the original passage in Jeremiah. Is the first word. Is there a balm in Gilead? It's a question. Is there? And I think for lots of Douglas's life, I don't know how he interpreted balm in Gilead. We know he loved the spirituals, but I think for a lot of his life, he would have had to interpret it in an Old Testament way. Is there a balm in Gilead? And I can't help starting with another passage from Jeremiah, because Frederick Douglass was an American Jeremiah. If you didn't know that, time to learn it. In the very first chapter of Jeremiah, it says this: "Behold, I have put my words in your mouth, to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, but to build and to plant, to tear down and build up." That's the great prophet Jeremiah. predicting, as did Isaiah and many of the other Hebrew prophets, that the temple in Jerusalem must be destroyed. It will be destroyed. The sins of the people are so horrific, the place, the city, the culture are so poisoned, it will be destroyed. Out of that somehow will come an exile. Out of that somehow will come some survival. Out of that somehow will be an Egyptian bondage. Out of that somehow, some will be at the mountain with Moses and get the law. And out of that somehow, some of them will get through the Babylonian captivity, and some of them will stay and get ruined by Babylon, but a few of them will survive, and they'll follow Joshua to something called a promised land. That story is what Douglass placed himself in, placed his people in, and placed his country in. You cannot understand Mr. Douglass without understanding how deeply steeped he was in biblical story, especially Old Testament story. And I say that not as a matter of his faith necessarily, but of where he learned language, how he came by words, how he became a storyteller, and the historical vision through which he saw his life, his people, and his country. Now, I want to begin with a few general thoughts, and then I want to take us, as I should, to at least 3 little episodes of his life here in Rochester, his place here in Rochester, his words here from Rochester. But some other words first, real quickly. In the speech he gave at the dedication of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. on the 24th of September, 2016, President Barack Obama delivered what he called a clear-eyed view of a tragic and triumphant history of Black Americans in the United States. Now, this was one of Obama's last major public addresses. He gave lots of campaign speeches after that in that election. But this was one his speechwriters worked hard on, as did he. He was the first African-American president of the United States dedicating the African-American Museum. This wasn't just going to be a throwaway moment. It was like Douglass being invited to dedicate the Freedmen's Memorial to Lincoln in 1876. He could have just given some kind of little occasional celebration speech. He didn't. He gave the second greatest speech of his life. The first was in Rochester, the 4th of July speech, of course. That's that nasty teaching trick where you say, it's the second most important this and the second most important that, and the students, of course, have to ask, so what's first? And then you get to proselytize. But anyway, back to Obama. Obama likened the African-American experience to what he called the infinite depths of Shakespeare and Scripture. This wasn't going to be superficial. The embrace of truth, said Obama, as best we can know it, is where real patriotism lies. And then naming some of the major pivots of the country's history, Obama wrapped his central theme in a remarkable sentence about the epoch of the Civil War era. And he said, quoting Obama, "We have buttoned up our Union blues to join the fight for our freedom. We've railed against injustice for decade upon decade, a lifetime of struggle and progress and enlightenment that we see etched in Frederick Douglass's mighty leonine gaze." Now, I know that's presidential rhetoric on a hugely important occasion. But he could have chosen lots of other people to start the speech with. He could have started with Rosa Parks. He could have started with, Harriet Tubman. She's everywhere now, except on the bill she's supposed to be on. Wasn't that decided 2 years ago? A lot of things we thought were decided a couple of years ago. Anyway, but he could have chosen Martin Luther King. King comes up later in the speech, of course, and so on. But through the lens of, through the leonine gaze of Frederick Douglass. That's how he started. Why not? And by the way, if you get up close to this one, you've probably gotten up close to other statues around town, those eyes, my God, it's haunting. But how Americans react to Douglass's gaze in the 160-odd photographs of the most photographed American of the 19th century, we now believe, how we react to his gaze, how we gaze back at him, and more importantly, how we read, appropriate him, use him, and engage his legacies, informs how we use our past to determine who we say we are. Douglass's life and writing emerged from nearly the full scope of the 19th century. He's representative of the best and the worst, one might say, in the American spirit. He constantly probed the ironies of America's contradictions over slavery and race. Few Americans ever used Shakespeare and the Bible, as Obama implied, to comprehend his story and that of his people as much as Douglass did. And there may be no better example of an American radical patriot than the slave who became the lyrical prophet of the ideas of freedom, natural rights, and human equality. Obama channeled Douglass in that dedication speech, and knowingly or not, a lot of us do today. Now, to some Rochester stories. And of course, to this great anniversary. This December 3 is the anniversary of the publication of the first issue of the North Star, Douglass's own newspaper, founded here in the fall of 1847, less than a year after he had returned from Great Britain, his 18-19-month sojourn to Ireland, Scotland, and England that transformed him in so many ways. Made him feel more independent, made him feel valued as he never had been in America, made him see cultures that could be relatively without racism, unlike America that was just defined by it and infused with it everywhere he went. He came back in the spring of 1847, angry. He goes out on the road with a speech that was so full of venom for his country that at one point Wendell Phillips, great Massachusetts abolitionist, took him aside and said, "Fred, tone it down. I mean, come on, don't drive away the audience." Another newspaper in Philadelphia called him the demagogue in black. I remember when I read that, I thought, chapter title, that's a chapter title. He was an angry young black man who had been abroad and flowered and been lionized and treated like he mattered and he was really important and he was this young genius. And for God's sake, Julie and her brother had written this farewell song about him, and they had hundreds of people at a farewell party for him in London, England, before he came back. And he had spoken in hundreds of places in Ireland, Scotland, and England. He'd met virtually every important reformer in Ireland, Scotland, and England. He came back to America, and in that speech he took on the road, he had a refrain. He said, "I have no country, I have no patriotism. My country defines me out, I define it out. I have no country, I have no patriotism." Now, that's not always going to be true. And if you've studied your Douglass, you know that this man goes through major transformations in his life, in his thought, in his sense of strategies. But he wanted independence from the Garrisonian abolitionists, from William Lloyd Garrison himself, who, though he loved Garrison, and Garrison was in many ways his mentor, even father figure, who indeed did discover him and give him his start as an abolitionist, Douglass owed a lot to Garrison and many other Garrisonians. But he needed to find his own place. He needed to find his own voice. And Rochester was his choice. He'd been here several times already, many times he'd passed through on lecture tours in the early 40s, throughout the 40s. But when he decided to move to Rochester, it had about 50,000 people. It was, of course, a hub of the Erie Canal. He plowed basically all the money he had into his type, his printing press, in hiring a printer, and then in renting an office on Buffalo Street, and in trying to create this North Star. The funds to create it came largely from his British friends. In fact, it came almost entirely from his British friends, without which he could never have done it. And he admitted that and thanked them endlessly. He moved out here by himself at first in the fall of 47. December 3, we've already said, is the first issue of the paper. There are lots of fascinating things in that first issue, if you go to it and look. But he went on the attack. That's what abolitionist newspapers did. And he'd learned that from Garrison, too. He went on the attack, and he attacked Henry Clay, the great Kentucky Whig statesman and colonizationist and slaveholder. He attacked the alleged moderation, he said, of Clay as a slaveholder and a colonizationist. He said Clay was the worst of all things. These are Douglas's words. He was the worst of all things, a well-meaning slaveholder. And as for Clay's benevolence, he said it was merely so much of Satan dressed up in the livery of heaven. And thousands of more times, as Douglas began to master that craft of the short-form political editorial, he would write these zinger sentences that if you were on the other end of that target, you didn't like it. The North Star in that first issue was dedicated, Douglas said, to liberty, humanity, and progress. Getting any one of them would have been a good start. Above all, he wanted a proud black newspaper. It was to be a proud black enterprise. There had been other black abolitionist newspapers. None had ever lasted very long. None had lasted more than 2 or 3 years, except the Christian Recorder, the great paper, although that doesn't start till the 50s. Anyway, the Christian Recorder lasted decades and decades. That was the paper of the National AME Church, published out of Philadelphia. He offered himself, he said, as a voice assailing, his words, the ramparts of slavery and prejudice. He promised to do both, attack slavery and attack racism in the North, which in some ways the Garrisonians had not wanted him to do. They wanted him to stick to the subject of slavery. To blacks, he said, I am, quote, one with you. I am of you. He asserted also that his paper would be a paper devoted to, his words now, learning and the pursuit of knowledge. It was a huge risk. The first printing press he bought was used and it failed. By mid-January of the next month, he had 700 subscribers. It will grow from that over time. But this paper never was on good financial footing. It would have died many times were it not from some benefactors who helped him. But by the end of 48, the first full year, the paper was sent abroad, as well as to many states. It was sent to Britain, to Canada, to Mexico, and Australia, and even to some parts of the South. He had a few subscribers in the South. They must have been very quiet people in their towns. Then there's Martin Delaney's role, of course, who was listed on the paper as his co-editor, but they never really were co-editors. Martin Delaney's job or role on the paper, as I know some of you know, was to be its traveling correspondent. Martin Delaney was older than Douglas by 5 or 6 years. He had a very different background. He'd been born free. He was very educated, formally educated, as opposed to Douglas having no education. Delaney's job was to go out and travel around the North. I mean, this is an amazing plan. It just wasn't easy to pull off. But Delaney was to go to black communities in particular, from Massachusetts to Ohio and beyond, and just write pieces about those black communities, the conditions of those communities, the churches in those communities, what's going on in those communities. And he did that, although there were many times when Douglas would write to Delaney to some post office somewhere and say, Martin, where are you? You couldn't find him. Hello, Martin. But Delaney did write, before he left the paper, 23 of these travel letters. They're fascinating, from communities all over, about the conditions and lives of free blacks in the North. Now, it took about $55 a week in those first years of the paper of expenses. That's just his basic expense per week to run that paper. And he very often could not meet it. Those many subscribers didn't pay up, and pretty soon the paper would always have that list of people who had not paid up with his chastisements. Haven't heard from you? That's sort of like the minister who greets you on Easter and says, haven't seen you any time during the year, But the North Star became a repository. This is the key, I think. It became both a repository and a trumpet of the dual cause of black abolitionism. So on the one hand, that cause was self-development of black communities, self-improvement of black communities. On the other hand, it was the crusade for political rights and civil rights and citizenship. And it indeed became that kind of paper. And for Mr. King, who is creating the new North Star, and I applaud you, and what a fantastic idea, wherever you are here tonight, $55 a week is all you need. So. Oh, that's right, wrong century. He moved his family out here in February of '48. It was a very difficult move for Anna. Anna had a life in Lynn, Massachusetts, a real life. She was mother, shoebinder, seamstress, church member. She had a little circle of friends. She liked it there. But her man was going to move again, and out she came to a place called Rochester. In recent years, at that point, she had lived without her husband far more months than she had lived with him. She was a very talented domestic woman. We certainly know that about her. In a lot of ways. She built Douglas's home. She was the post and pillar of his home. She raised the kids. The 3 boys came along with them, who were still boys. Their daughter Rosetta, who was the oldest, was not with them at that point. She was in Albany living with governesses, the Mott sisters. And Rosetta, indeed, the Douglases tried to get Rosetta the best education of all their children. In fact, she was the best educated of all 4 of the children, which is part of what makes her later marriage a kind of tragedy, at any rate. Isaac Post, here of the Post of Rochester, who were dear, dear friends of Douglas's, the Quakers, found them first a little apartment, a tenement in the middle of town, which was small and not so good. Douglas wrote a letter to a friend at one point declaring himself gloomy and most unhappy in this little tenement apartment. But by April of '48, they purchased that house at 4 Alexander Street, a 2-story, 9-room brick house. It had a front porch that Anna could sit on and watch the world, and it had at least a yard for a spring and summertime garden. Rochester also had a black community. In that year, about 162 households in a pretty close-knit black community. And in the summer of '48, the Douglas marriage was still certainly in every way solid because they conceived their 5th child. little Annie, Anna's namesake, who will, of course, only live to be 11 and die in 1860. In 1849, Julia Griffiths came. And I'll be very quick with this, but you cannot say enough about how important Julia became to the survival of the North Star and to, frankly, I think Douglas's own personal survival. She was the British woman who wrote that incredible piece of music we just heard with her brother. She was the daughter of abolitionists in Britain. She was very educated, brilliant woman, an incredible, intrepid organizer. Readley fought on this. She had met Douglas in England, and she came over in '49 and lived with the Douglases, or lived in Rochester, for the next 6 years. She became the assistant editor of that newspaper. She became the principal fundraiser of that newspaper. Without her, that paper would have died. She raised a great deal of money from the philanthropist Gerrit Smith. And she became a source of important professional and emotional support for Douglas. There's no question about that from her letters and indeed some of his. It blew up in scandal, of course, when the Garrisonians went after Douglas and attacked him in 1852 for supposedly having an affair in his own home under the eyes of his children, which we don't know for sure, but probably was not true. There's always going to be a debate about that one. But to Douglas, that paper became the core of his existence, and the struggle for its survival, the struggle for his own survival for several years. He called that newspaper, quote, he said, "It was the best school possible for me. It obliged me to think and read. It taught me to express my thoughts clearly." And another time he said, "I had an audience now to speak to every week, and I must say something worth hearing." And among the things I like to think I know about Douglas, which you always got to be careful about, can't put him in boxes, is that this was a man like a lot of us who didn't know what he really thought about something until he went to his desk and he wrote it. And it was in these years of writing those weekly editorials, sometimes 3 and 4 per week, about all kinds of issues, every kind of political issue, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, fugitive slave rescues, violence in Kansas, you name it, on and on and on and on and on. Henry Clay. But when he went to his desk and he took up pen, he would figure out what he thought. He was a writer. Above all else, a writer. All right. Now, go with me to another Rochester moment, and I'll provide some context. It's one of my favorites of all the little things I found in research. We get attached to our nuggets that we find in this business. Go with me to the election of 1864. Yeah, I'm skipping over the 4th of July speech because you already know too much about that. But I spent 11 pages in chapter 12 of the book analyzing that great speech. It is the rhetorical masterpiece of American reform rhetoric. It's in my view, I call it a symphony in 3 movements, but you can go read the book and judge whether, and I know symphonies usually have 4 movements. Sorry, musicians. But his only had 3. I tried to see a 4th, but it just isn't quite there. Anyway, but the election of '64, a brief context here. It's the middle of the Civil War, of course. It's Lincoln's re-election, but there was nothing certain about Lincoln being re-elected. Nothing at all certain about it. The war is by no means over when this election year kicks in the winter and spring of 1864. The great campaign, the Overland Campaign in Virginia, has not begun yet. That horrific stalemate it'll reach by July and August around Petersburg and elsewhere in Virginia has not happened yet. Sherman has invaded Georgia, but the siege of Atlanta hasn't started yet. The war is not won. And Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, faces re-election. The only time we know of in modern history when a republic tried to hold a general election in the midst of a civil war. General elections aren't easy to have in peacetime. The Democrats, in opposing Lincoln and the Republicans, did what political parties always do. They went for the wedge issue. And they had arguably the greatest wedge issue ever, emancipation. The Republican Party was, by the spring of 1864, the party of freeing slaves. They couldn't run from it, although they're going to try. It's painted all over them. They got it stamped on their forehead. Emancipation. And the Democrats go for the jugular. They called Abraham Lincoln the unlover. They called him Abraham Africanus I, implying that he was really black. They said their only real aim of the Republican Party was racial miscegenation. They even invented the word miscegenation. It got into the American Dictionary and Lexicon that year. They created all kinds of iconic, weird art about miscegenation balls being held in New York, led by the Republican Party. I always tell my students, the 1864 election was the most racist election in our history until the next one. Because the one in '68 was really kind of worse. The Democratic Party played the race card explicitly. There's nothing subtle about it. And the Republicans, under great duress, they get nervous. They get really nervous. And they start to kind of hedge on emancipation. Not really Lincoln himself, at least not too overtly, but William Seward, the Secretary of State, and others start issuing statements in the summer of '64, after Lincoln finally did get the nomination. But there was a movement to dump Lincoln in the Republican Party and go for John C. Fremont again. And Douglas flirted with doing it himself. But he didn't. The Republicans are running scared. They're not sure. There's no guarantee, because the war weariness in this war is horrific. The casualty rate's terrible. The stalemate in Virginia, stalemate in Georgia. Admiral Farragut has not yet taken Mobile Bay, which didn't happen until August 25th. So Lincoln invites Douglas to the White House. The first time they met in '63 in August, Douglas went on his own, just basically knocked on the door and said, "Please let me in. I want to protest the president and the discriminations against black troops." And he got in, and they had a very interesting meeting. But the second time, Lincoln invites him, because Lincoln suddenly needed the help of the most famous black person in America. And to make a long story short, that meeting lasted longer than the first one. And at that meeting, Lincoln looked Douglas in the eye and asked him to become the leader, the chief agent of a scheme, a plan that was supposed to be conducted by the Army to funnel as many slaves out of the Upper South as possible before Election Day in case he loses the election. And I don't know for certain what was going on in Douglas's mind, but I think his reaction was, "Okay, how do I do this?" "Well, the Army will help you." "Oh?" He went home to Rochester, had about 10 days to begin writing letters and sending telegrams to lots of his abolitionist friends and the people who had worked on recruiting black soldiers and so on. And he had a lot of correspondence going, but he was saved because of the fall of Atlanta, first week of September. And then Farragut's taking Mobile Bay. And then Phil Sheridan's moves down the Shenandoah Valley, and the whole nature of the war shifted, especially that fall of Atlanta. It had a tremendous effect on Northern morale and Northern opinion, and the prospects of Lincoln's reelection greatly improved. But what about the campaign? Douglas wanted to campaign for Lincoln, and the Republican Party wouldn't let him. They did not want him out on the stump. This famous black man's going to be out on the stump? We're already painted with emancipation. Let's not let him out there. And they wouldn't let him out there. He did go to a major black convention in Syracuse in October. Had 150-odd delegates from all over the country. It was the first major black convention that had been held in 9 years, and Douglas gave a barn burner of a keynote speech I won't go into it. He gave a barn burner of a speech saying, now, it's possible this war could be won. It is possible emancipation can be real. And then on election night, he's here in Rochester. And I found this, and it's only a single clipping is all I have on it, but man, sometimes you go with that one source when you have it, right? It was in the Evans collection in Savannah that made this possible. Anyway, the clipping was written by a man in 1881 who was a Rochesterite, who remembered that on election night in '64, he was a poll worker. And he had put Frederick Douglass's ballot in the box that night. By the 1880s, Douglass was a little bit like Lincoln already. People who had known Douglass, lunched with Douglass, heard Douglass, talked to Douglass, done this with Douglass, carried his bags, would write something in the paper and it would be, I did this with Douglass. I saw Douglass. This guy's story is quite remarkable because he says later that night, he walked back in South Avenue with Douglass, downtown to the telegraph office to check the voting returns. And it was pretty late at night, and he says, out of a street or an alley came 4 white drunken thugs that challenged Douglass to a brawl with the N-word and all the rest. And he claims Douglass put up his fist and said, come on, let's have it. And according to this witness, the drunken thugs scurried off into the alley, and there was no fight. But he turns it into this wonderful moment of how Douglass had he says, a physical victory and a political victory. Well, I don't know if that encounter happened, but I used it anyway. But the important thing is that following Sunday, Douglass went where he had gone so many Sundays, to the Spring Street AME Church, which is now sometimes called the Favor Street AME Church. I've been trying to investigate and talk to people now to know just exactly where was that church, but the original Spring Street Church, which is what it's called in the text of the speeches he gave there. He did whole lecture series there on Sunday, on Sunday afternoons for years. But he went to the AME Church on that following Sunday to a packed house, and he started his speech with a line from Genesis. When Frederick Douglass needed a text, needed a metaphor, he almost always, for really special moments, he almost always went to the Old Testament. The text is simple. In Genesis 8, and the dove came into him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from the earth. Douglass opened his speech that day with the story of Noah's Ark. And he told this famous story of how Noah wonders after the ark has stopped, could the flood have ended? And he sends a dove out of the ark, and the dove comes back with an olive branch in its beak. And Noah thinks, oh my God, something's alive. So he sends the dove out again, and the dove does not return. And Noah takes that as the cause to take the tarp off the ark, and it says, lo, the earth has been renewed. To explain emancipation, to explain the meaning of Lincoln's re-election, and now the real possibility this war is going to be prosecuted to victory and true emancipation, he went to the oldest rebirth metaphor in Western civilization, Noah's Ark. Now today, you might not be able to do that with audiences. They'd say, Noah? A dove? Arks? Oh, man, floods? What's he talking about, Katrina or what? But he didn't stop there. He also announced in that speech that the following Sunday he was going back to Baltimore. He'd never been back to Baltimore, where he'd escaped from slavery in 1838. Actually, he'd passed through Baltimore on the train coming into Washington, but he never got off. He said, I'm going back to Baltimore. I'm going back to the free soil of Baltimore because Maryland had just held a referendum on November 1st to decide whether to become a free state. The vote was unbelievably close. It was something like 30,200 and something to 29,900 and something. It was one of those, like the elections we've been having recently, 0.0 something of 1%. But the vote was yes to be a free state. And Douglas says, I'm going back to the free soil of Maryland. And he did. The following Sunday, he went back to Baltimore. He had paparazzi in tow now. Press is with him, and that's how we know about what he said and what went on. And he went to the Bethel AME Church on Dallas Street in Fells Point, one of the churches he had attended, worshiped at, lived in and out of when he'd been a slave, a teenage slave. Huge crowd is there. They can't fit into the church. But when he gets to the front of the church, he's met by a woman. It was his sister, Eliza. Her name was Eliza Mitchell. She was about 2 or 3 years older. They hadn't seen each other since 1836. Hello, Frederick. I'm Eliza. I named one of my 8 children for you. Eliza's an amazing story. She purchased her own freedom, or her husband purchased her freedom. He grabbed her by the arm. They walked up the main aisle of the church. We're told by the press that the church was surrounded by American flags. And he got up to take the pulpit, and he did in part what he did in Rochester. He opened with Noah. He tells the story. Noah sent the dove out. The dove came back with the olive branch. Noah sent the dove out again, and the dove didn't return. And lo, the world is renewed. But then he said, but that I am back in Baltimore on the free soil of Maryland, I am the dove. Now that takes chutzpah. To put yourself into the Noah's Ark story. I mean, my God. But it worked. I mean, you'd have been melted by that, wouldn't you? I mean, my God. I am the dove, returning as the message of renewal and hope and life. Well, last very little Rochester story, and I'll really end with this. Although I wanted to do some things about the funeral, which happened here. God. Oh, my God. No. It's just too much. Besides, I got a couple details wrong, and one of you who's here tonight is the one who wrote to me a week and a half ago to tell me the details I got wrong. I appreciate it. I really do. One of the risks is you write a book that people actually read is you find out some things you did wrong. So I can take it, I think. But go with me to the next spring. On the night of April 14, 1865, Good Friday, when the crack of John Wilkes Booth's pistol rang out in Ford's Theater, eventually killing Lincoln, Douglas had just returned to Rochester from yet another pretty long speaking tour all over the East. He'd been to and witnessed whole towns in great joy over the Confederate surrender and the end of the war. He, like millions, would never forget the moment he heard the news of the many shocks, he later wrote, endured in the 4 years of the war. Douglas said, the death of Lincoln was the worst. He called it the grand convulsion, as if, quote, the solid earth opened and swallowed up one of our chief towns or cities. The event instantly became an eternal marker of human memory, as we now have our markers our flashbulb memories, as the neuroscientists call them. A hush fell upon the land, said Douglas, as though each man, these are his words, in it heard a voice from heaven, an uninterpreted sound from the sky, and had paused to learn its meaning. The extremes of feeling were all but impossible to bear. He called them irreconcilable at that moment. Now, such it would be for Douglas, who over time fashioned several different kinds of eulogies and symbols and memories of the martyred Lincoln. He would invent about 3 different kinds of Lincolns over time, depending on the political purposes to which he wanted to use him. He never let his audiences forget, though, that Booth and his conspirators, though they were individual assassins and fierce Confederate partisans, Douglas said it was slavery itself, the insolent, aggressive, his words, and malignant oligarchy in the last spasm of its madness that had murdered Lincoln. In Rochester, as in hundreds of other towns and cities all across the North, as well as in 1,000 places all across the South among former slaves, a springtime of relief turned overnight into horror and mourning. On the 15th, a huge throng of people gathered in Rochester City Hall at about 3 p.m., not knowing, it said in the press, what else to do in the agony of the hour. Much of the crowd could not even fit into the space, as Mayor Daniel Moore presided. Several clergymen spoke. Douglas was sitting in the rear of the hall as a loud chant began to ring out, and this had happened many, 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 many times in his life. The chant came, Douglas, 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 Douglas. They wanted to hear from Douglas. They weren't going to let him just sit back there. The mass of people parted for a pathway, and Douglas walked through them to the platform. He recalled feeling, he said, quote, stunned and overwhelmed. In his remarks, he declared it a day for silence and meditation, for grief and for tears. He tried to wrest hope, though, from all the despair. And he didn't remain silent. Less than 24 hours after the assassination, on that Easter weekend, Douglas insisted in the speech that he got up and gave. He insisted on seeing in the president's sacrifice a new life for the nation. He was ready with this deeply Christian kind of crucifixion sacrifice imagery. Though Abraham Lincoln dies, the republic lives, he practically shouted. In Lincoln's blood, he said, they would find the salvation of our country. Douglas tried to mute his partisanship in this moment of grief, but he couldn't do it. The subdued audience began to actually cheer, even laugh, as Douglas complained that it was only yesterday that too many people were, in his words, manifesting almost as much gratitude to General Lee for surrendering as to General Grant for compelling him to surrender. Douglas insisted on Appomattox as a victory, not a story of mutual honor. Crimes of treason and slavery, he said in this speech, ought not to be met with amnesty and oblivion in behalf of men whose hands are red with the best blood of our land. He pleaded that people not be too ready to, quote, do the work of restoration yet. Not to make, he said, haste, quote, to nurse the spirit that gave birth to Booth. Lincoln hasn't been dead a day. and he's already laying out the argument for the memory of the war. Douglas must have been carrying a copy of the second inaugural in his pocket, or by then he had actually memorized long key passages. After telling of shaking Lincoln's hand on Inauguration Day a month earlier, Douglas deftly floated into the president's poetry. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. If Douglas did this from memory or not, many in the crowd must have just been choking or gasping back tears. Yet if God will that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said that the judgments of the Lord are righteous altogether. Lincoln's words. For so long, Frederick Douglass had wanted to write such words for Lincoln to speak. Now, he could indeed speak them for the president in a shared, sacred effort. Before he ended, though, this former slave put it all in a simple paraphrase of Lincoln's own argument. Douglas's sentence was, "Let us never forget that justice to the Negro is safety to the nation." Much later in his Life and Times, the third autobiography, Douglas gave this moment a very special treatment, or a personal meaning. I had resided long in Rochester, he wrote, and had made many speeches there, which had more or less touched the hearts of my hearers, but never to this day was I brought into such close accord with them. We shared in common a terrible calamity, and this touch of nature made us more than countrymen. It made us kin. His use of the words countrymen and kin seems to me are revealing. So much of the war's meaning, of his own life, were caught up in those words. In common grief with his mostly white fellow Rochester citizens, this black orator felt a sense of belonging. The war had provided a common sense of nationhood. Lincoln's death somehow virtually a common sense of family. Douglas had often used his own story as the embodiment of America's representative exiled son. Out of a common search for meaning in Lincoln's violent death at the dawn of peace, Douglas seems to have felt a unity with his fellow Americans. His sense of birthright may have felt more complete that afternoon than ever before. The exiled son who had returned to the free state of Maryland in late 1864 as Noah's sign that the flood, or slavery and war, was almost over, was the same exiled son returning to Rochester in April 1865 to announce national redemption through Lincoln's blood. Both of those were homecomings, one to Douglas's native Maryland and the other to his adopted Western New York. His two lives, two homes, two sides of the Chesapeake, slavery and freedom, were no longer divided. At least for that moment, Douglas could weep tears of kinship with his countrymen. Well, Just one, I'm not going to do the whole funeral here. Nah. But I do want to tell you my favorite little eulogy. There just were thousands of eulogies of Douglass. I mean, they're all over the country, all over the world. The newspaper reportage of Douglass's death was the death of, not just a great American, but a very special sort of human being in Western civilization, the way his death was treated. And I have all kinds of examples of this in the epilogue of the book. I don't overload you with it, but I probably did overload a little bit with it. But there are just so many different kinds of eulogies. But one of my favorites is embedded in a much longer memoir by Francis Grimke. Francis Grimke was an African-American minister, a generation younger than Douglass, but they were very dear friends. Grimke, in fact, had married Frederick and Helen in his second marriage in 1884. And that was important because Douglass took a tremendous beating over that second marriage, but the Grimkes always supported him. But embedded in Grimke's memoir is this little story he tells of being at dinner at Douglass's house about 3 weeks before he died. So it would have been the last week of January or the first week of February of 1895. And Grimke says there were like a dozen people at dinner, and when dinner ended, Douglass says, "All right, everybody into the parlor. Let's have music. Let's sing." And he got up and grabbed his violin, and his son Joseph was there, and of course many of you know that his grandson, Joseph was the great concert violinist. I mean, Joseph was a real violinist. Joseph grabbed his violin, and Douglass struck up his, and he led the group in singing Rock of Ages. And he stood in the doorway of the parlor, said Grimke, in his booming baritone, and sang all 4 verses while strumming on his violin of Rock of Ages. And then, of course, Grimke converts that into his own memory of thinking. He says, that night I already thought he may be on the edge of Jordan already and not far from stepping over. In the sight of Jordan's billow, let thy bosom be my pillow. Hide me, O Rock of Ages, safe in thee. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Blight. I'm always so amazed that there's still something to learn about Frederick Douglass 200 years after his birth, and that was a real treat. You can purchase your very own copy of Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, out in the lobby, where Professor Blight will also be signing these books for you following the conclusion of the speaking portion of this event. So the only way that we could follow up that informative lecture is to call the family of Frederick Douglass on stage. Please help me welcome Nettie Washington Douglass, her son Kenneth Morris Jr., and Robert Benz of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives.
You want to wave or bow or something? Thank you. My name is Robert Benz. I want to thank Mayor Lovely Warren and the City of Rochester for such a warm welcome. Thank you. Thank you for this logo. Excellent. Love that. Thank you to David Blight for not only writing great books, but for having great books on your tie. Excellent. There's no better example of the power of reading and the love of great books than Frederick Douglass, of course, especially for young people. How many young people are here tonight? For the young people, meaning 90 and below, 90 and below. Once you're 90, you gotta think about giving up the moniker of young people. But I want to introduce the chairwoman of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, who happens to be the great-great-granddaughter of Frederick Douglass, and she's also the great-granddaughter of Booker T. Washington, Nettie Washington Douglass.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I am really touched. I have been asked to do a special, to share my family history and how they came together, but this is my first time seeing the statue. To Carvin, wherever you are, to come up with this idea, this walking tour. Olivia, are you still out there? Magnificent, magnificent. I am so particular about statues of Frederick Douglass, and there are 4 that are my favorites, and 2 of them are right here in Rochester. What you all probably don't know, the reason I'm tearing up, 2 reasons, because it's magnificent, but also those hands. They're my son Kenny's hands. And Olivia, first of all, Olivia, my great-grandmother on my Washington side, his name is Olivia. Kenny's younger daughter, my younger granddaughter, is Olivia. Her middle name is Olivia. It's a very special name. But I saw your YouTube video when you were talking about, and you were actually doing some sculpting. And I learned something that I did not know. You said that the original statue here that was unveiled in 1899 on June 9th, which happens to be Kenny's birthday many years later, but they share that. You said that Charles, his youngest son, who's my great-grandfather, was also used for the original statue, which I thought was fascinating. And then you went on to say, and here we are several generations later, and another descendant as part of the statue. So I'm just delighted and thrilled to be here. So let me, as I say, I've been asked to tell you how I'm related, have the honor and the privilege of being related to both Booker Washington and Frederick Douglass. I had absolutely nothing to do with it, but I am thrilled that, and I'm an only child, that I joined the bloodlines together. And the way that happened is that my father was Frederick Douglass III, and he was Frederick Douglass's great-grandson. And my father grew up in D.C. He graduated from Meharry Medical College, and in the summer of 1941, he was commissioned to the only black VA hospital in the country, which happened to be in Tuskegee. And so he went down there. He was a surgeon. So he arrived in August of 1941. And then Booker T. Washington's granddaughter, who was born in Tuskegee Institute, birth certificate says Tuskegee Institute, she grew up in California, and she had come home for a 2-week vacation to visit family and friends. And so romantic. And it was obviously God's plan. My future father was on a dinner break from the hospital, and the medical staff knew that they could walk across campus and eat in the student dining hall to kind of get away from the hospital food. So this particular evening, he was on night duty. He was a surgeon. He's walking across campus, heading to get something to eat. Booker T. Washington's granddaughter, Nettie Hancock Washington, was rushing across campus. She was taking a shortcut. She was running late, and she was going to meet either family or friends, and they literally collided. Literally collided. Love at first sight. Now, I know he didn't know who she was at that moment. Her last name was Washington, that, common name. But they fell in love, and they were married 3 months later. And the thing I love about this story, I often think, had he not gone to the campus, to the dining hall to eat that night, if she had been on time, a second I wouldn't have been standing here sharing this story and crying about this statue. So it truly is, I really do believe, for whatever reason, it was God's will. But the thing that I love so much about this is that Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington were friends. Frederick Douglass was the 7th commencement speaker at Tuskegee Institute's commencement, and they often exchanged letters. As a matter of fact, the day before Frederick Douglass had his heart attack, February the 20th, he wrote a letter, and it was to Booker Washington. And he was just going over some things that they had talked about and just reminding him to get in touch with this person to see about funding, for funding for the school. And when I spent my summers with my grandmother at Highland Beach in Frederick Douglass's summer home, there was a picture that hung in the little cottage in the living room that was from Booker T, and he had just signed to Booker T. Washington. So I know from the stories I've heard that they were friends. And I'm going to follow the historian David, which you said earlier. I don't know that this is fact, but I'm going to use it anyway. I would like to think that that was the last letter he wrote before he died, and it was to Booker T. Washington, who would later, by the grace of God, they would become in-laws. So that's my story. That's how it happened. And I'm thrilled to be here this evening to share it with you. And let me also echo everything that David Blight said about Rochester and what you all have done this year for Frederick Douglass's bicentennial. I am signed up to Google Alerts, anything Frederick Douglass. Often I find out where Kenny is, and he's been here. I find out where David is, and I found out about the statue. And then Kenny sent me a picture, and he said, look, there was a picture of 2 little boys holding each hand. And he said, oh, they're holding my hand. And just reading his text to me, I teared up. I do that easily. But it's been a joy. This is my 3rd visit to Rochester, and it's been several years since I've been here. And it's an honor to be here for this bicentennial celebration. Thank you so very, very much.
Nettie always makes being a descendant of 2 of the most important legacies in America so simple. It just happened that way. What I'm about to say is a fact. No one can dispute this. Being the last-born son, it's my obligation and my honor, of course, to introduce Nettie's firstborn son. He is the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, and he's the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. Say hello to Kenneth B. Morris, Jr.
Oh, man. Whew, what a night. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, and I'm a little shocked because I thought my mom was going to stand up here with me while I was giving my remarks, but she said what she had to say, dropped the mic, and left. I needed that support because, like David, and by the way, David, brilliant lecture that you gave tonight. David and I have been traveling all over the country together for this bicentennial, and he mentioned when he started that this was the first time that he had given a lecture in the shadow of Frederick Douglass, and I spent most of my life trying to escape that long, vast shadow of one of this country's greatest heroes. So there is a little bit of pressure that I'm feeling right now, and I too feel like he might well, I guess that would be my hand reaching on my shoulder to pull me back. That's kind of a strange thought. Thank you, Robert, for that introduction. You've heard that the activist Sean King is relaunching the North Star. And he was supposed to be here tonight. You've heard him mentioned several times. And he and his wife, Ray, like Frederick and Anna, have 5 children. And one of their young daughters fell ill right when they were headed up. So he wasn't able to be here, but he asked me to read these remarks to you. He said, the life, legacy, words, and actions of Frederick Douglass are as important today as they've ever been. A real part of me wishes that we somehow outlive the usefulness of an abolitionist wisdom, but we haven't. In this country and all over the world, people are still bound and in need of freedom. History does repeat itself, but that can go both ways. When we normally say that, we mean that the horrors of history too often happen over and over again, but all of us in this room can also repeat the heroism of history, and we can start by following the courageous path set before us by Frederick Douglass. That is what we are trying to do with the rebuilding and relaunching of the North Star. His abolitionist newspaper started right here in Rochester. And I'm sorry that I cannot be there with you all tonight, but I look forward to working with you all so much in the months and years ahead. That's Sean King. So we've been talking a lot about history, but this history is also about the present and it's about the future. And I love listening to my mom's story about how my grandparents met. I never get tired of it, but there's one part of the story that troubles me a little bit, and that is my grandparents met after only knowing each other for 3 months. And as the father of 2 young daughters, and all you young people up there, I don't recommend that you get married after only 3 months of knowing somebody. But it was truly a love story, and I think meant to happen. As you heard, I am the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, and also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. And every time I tell people what my relationship is to my ancestors, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel very far removed. And you might be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people know or knew a grandparent. Some of you may have even known a great-grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors. Because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old, and she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, lived to be 95, and she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother Fanny Douglass's lap as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting on my Aunt Portia's lap, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And several years ago, I was with a group of 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, and they were looking at me cross-eyed when I introduced myself, like, man, you are so far removed. And what does all of this history have to do with my life today? And I was trying to give them some context and help them wrap their minds around the distance between the generations. And I had this thought, which I think was profound, that hands that actually touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine. So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand just one person away from history. I stand one person away from each man, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country, and we've had the honor and privilege since we started the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives in 2007 to dialogue with tens of thousands of students in every corner of the country. And a lot of times they think this history happened so long ago. And when they look at the great heroes and heroines in the textbooks, it's hard for them to imagine that they were real life living people that struggled and overcame and survived and effect change. And when we teach about Frederick Douglass in the classroom, his life and legacy becomes a tangible example for a young person who's struggling, who's in communities where there are challenges to receive equal opportunity and economic opportunity and disparities in health care and economic challenges in education, to look at his life and say, if he was able to overcome slavery, and how did he do that? He did it by stealing his own education, because we know it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. And later in life, when they would see this white-haired statesman who was the first African-American nominated for Vice President of the United States, first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American Recorder of Deeds in the District of Columbia, first African-American Ambassador and Consul General to Haiti, and first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor right here in Rochester. And many other accolades, and they would say, Frederick, I need to know, where'd you go to school? Where did you get your education? And he would sometimes respond by saying, my degree is written on my back. So of course, I'm so proud to have his blood flowing through my veins. And I'm so proud, along with Robert Benz, to lead our organization and to make this history come alive for young people out there. Now, before I move on and talk about a project that we're working on, I cannot leave this space today and not mention my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass. We are as proud as Anna as we are of Frederick. And there would be no Frederick Douglass without Anna Murray Douglass. I don't have time to go into the whole story, but I will tell you that we believe that they met in Baltimore. She was born free, and Frederick was working on the ship docks as a ship caulker and faithfully bringing his money back to his master every single day. And at some point, Frederick and Anna met, and she was one of the first people to plant the seed of thought in his mind that, Frederick, you're not meant to be a slave. And as they began to fall in love, she said, Frederick, I don't want our children's father to be a slave. Had she not sold her personal belongings, her feather bed, helped to sew the sailor's disguise that he wore, history may have taken a very different course had Frederick Douglass not had the courage and the help from Anna to escape slavery on September 3rd, 1838, at the age of 20. And so when we talk to young people about history, we're making history tonight. For everything that we're learning and how we're interacting with each other, it's going to reverberate beyond the walls of this performance hall. And we're going to go and we're going to talk to people about the lecture that we heard tonight from David Blight, and you're going to read his book, and you're going to be moved by it, as I have been. And so for a young person, when they can think that they can affect history and change the course of history by how they interact with people at every moment in time. And so these are some of the lessons that we try and teach. And then, of course, in the life of Douglass, the lesson of education and literacy is the most important for a young person, along with social service and taking action and civic engagement. But last night, we had a program, and we were talking about getting woke, and that's something that young people talk about all the time. Because I mentioned, when I got woke, which wasn't until my 30s, by the way, where I started to understand how my consciousness had been shaped by the false history and the whitewashed history that we've been given in this country. And so Frederick Douglass got woke at the tender age of 9 when he heard his master say to him, education will unfit him to be a slave. And Frederick looked at his master and he thought, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge is power, which is a message that we hear today, young people hear today, and education is liberation, and education is his pathway to freedom. And so he teaches himself to read and write. And then he starts asking critical questions, which we hope our young people will do when they start to get exposed to the legacy of Frederick Douglass. He starts asking simple questions like, why am I a slave? And why do you own me? And how come you know your birthday, but I don't know my birthday. And then he would turn to God and he would pray for God to break his chains and for deliverance and freedom. And he would say, God, I don't know, I can't understand why my master puts on a suit every Sunday and goes to church, and in the Bible and the Word and the Scripture finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, rape, pillage, and plunder his property. And he starts to differentiate from what he would later call the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ versus the slave-holding Christianity of the land. And so these are some of the messages that we're teaching. Now, I could sit up here and thank everybody. Thank goodness my mom already did that. But I do want to send a special shout out to Dr. David Anderson. I don't know where you are, David. Where is he? And his lovely wife, Ruth. As you all know, David has been carrying the Frederick Douglass torch for a long time. And on behalf of the family of Frederick Douglass, thank you for everything that you have done to teach not only people that come through this community, but young people about the life and legacy and the importance and the contributions of our great ancestor. Thank you very much. I wish I could run down there and give you a hug, but I'll do that afterwards. I started off by talking about Anna. Well, those of you that are here in town know that the school number 12, formerly the Duffy School, which sits on the site where the Frederick Douglass home once sat, was renamed the Anna Murray Douglass Academy. And so we thank you and thank all of you for honoring her in that way. Just going to say something quickly about how we started and then turn the mic back over to Robert. In 2005, Robert handed me a National Geographic magazine cover story, and the headline was 21st Century Slaves. And I looked at that headline, and I reacted the way I think most people do the first time they hear about the existence of human trafficking and modern-day slavery, and that slavery didn't end with the work of Douglass and the abolitionists or the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, but slavery still exists in every country around the world, including right here in the United States and including right here in Rochester. And I remember doing some further research, and I read an article about a 12-year-old girl who was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia. And I was reading this article at night in my living room, and down the hallway I could hear my girls getting ready for bed. And at the time, they were 12 and 9 years old, so my older daughter was the same age as this girl that I was reading about. And my daughters are laughing, they're playing, they're getting ready to get tucked safely into their beds, and my mind just starts going crazy. I had spent most of my life running away from these legacies for a lot of reasons, but not embracing it, decisively disengaged until Providence called in my life, and that was hearing my daughters getting ready for bed. And I set down the article and I went in to say goodnight to them. And I had this moment where I didn't feel like I could even look them in the eyes. And everything started welling up in me, and I'm thinking, this is what young girls and boys should be doing, getting tucked safely into bed and not being forced into bed to service some sick individual countless times every single day. And I felt like I couldn't look my girls in the eyes and walk away from this and not do anything. And it really was almost an instantaneous moment where everything started welling up in me, all of this history. And when Robert and I started talking, we thought, okay, well, what can we do about this? We can look at the legacy of the great abolitionist in Douglass and the legacy of the great educator and founder of Tuskegee Institute, Booker T. Washington. Aha! If we combine those legacies, abolition through education, institutionalized knowledge in communities and classrooms, we can unfit communities to allow slavery to thrive and exist, with young people being the starting point. And we heard earlier from the mayor, it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. So to build strong children, We have published a special bicentennial edition of Frederick Douglass's narrative, his first autobiography that was published in 1845. He was 27 years old, a fugitive slave, only 7 years removed from slavery, with no formal education, and he writes this classic piece of literature that the Library of Congress named one of the 88 books that shaped America. And so here we are all these years later talking about his words. And so we have published this book. We're making it accessible to young people because we want to inspire young people with Frederick Douglass's words to believe that you can do and be anything possible. And we're going to give away 1 million copies of this book. I don't care how long it takes, we're going to do that. Thank you. And here in Rochester, with the help of Michelle Daniels.
Well, thank you so much, Nettie, Ken, and Robert, for your tireless work to end human trafficking and for reminding us of the importance of fortifying the legacy of your great ancestor, Frederick Douglass. This is so exciting for Rochester. Before we conclude this part of the evening, we'd like to leave you with some of Douglass's own words, spoken on January 9th, 1894, when Douglass was nearing the end of his life. We know that Frederick Douglass was all about building strong children, and that message is not lost on us today. So in closing, please help me welcome our youngest speaker, Tien-Shing Stevens, a senior at McQuaid Jesuit High School and a past Douglass Oratorical Competition medalist and alumni of the Frederick Douglass Club, led by Michelle Garcia Daniels and coached by Dr. David Sankofa Anderson. Tien will read an excerpt from Douglass's Lesson of the Hour.
As if I could be heard by this great nation, I would call to mind the sublime and glorious truths which, at its birth, saluted a listening world. Its voice then was the trump of an archangel, summoning hoary forms of oppression and time-honored tyranny to judgment. Crowned heads heard it and shrieked. Toiling millions heard it and clapped their hands for joy. It announced the advent of a nation based upon human brotherhood and the self-evident truths of liberty and equality. Its mission was the redemption of the world from the bondage of ages. Apply these sublime and glorious truths to the situation now before you. Put away your race prejudice. Banish the idea that one class must rule over another. Recognize the fact that the rights of the humblest citizen are as worthy of protection of those of the highest. And your problem will be solved. And whatever may be in store for you in the future, whether prosperity or adversity, whether it shall have foes within or foes without, whether there shall be peace or war, based upon the eternal principles of truth, justice, and humanity, and with no class having any cause of complaint or grievance. Your republic will stand and flourish forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tien-Shing, for that beautiful reading. And in closing tonight, we do thank you all for coming. I do want to leave you with one of Douglass's shortest quotes as we head into the new year and close this bicentennial year, and that's to agitate, agitate, agitate. Thank you.